It may appear incongruous to talk about Marxism and Zionism in one sentence, because if you look at it today, Zionism and the Zionist state are associated with the right wing, with the nationalist right wing, and Marxism doesn't seem to belong at all to this story. However, historically, Marxism did play a very important role in, I would say, creating the Zionist settlement in Palestine and in developing the state structures of the new state of Israel. I would like to begin with reminding the basic ideas of what is Marxism and what is Zionism. It will help us to understand what we're talking about, which is always useful. What are the basic ideas of Marxism? Marxism is a way of looking at society and looking at history of societies. And the motive force of history, according to Marx and those who follow him, is the class struggle. The class struggle is a concept that had existed before Marx, but he elevated it to the level of motive force of history. And he presented history as a series of changes of socioeconomic structures, all of which resulted from class struggles. His basic contradiction that he outlined, and some of you may have had to study it for many years at the university, is when the forces of production, the productive forces, no longer can no longer be harmonized with the relations of production. So, in other words, with the form of development of technology, among other things, development of technology, development of industry, makes old structures obsolete. They no longer fit the new way of, and I think we are living in something like that today, because we need technology develops much faster than society. But it doesn't mean that there is class struggle today. But what I mean, at that time, in the 19th century, class struggle was seen as a motive force because there was a concentration of workers in large industrial enterprises, and these workers were selling their labor. They had nothing else to sell. And therefore, Marx said that this working class will be the revolutionary class that will create changes, and eventually that would lead in the most developed industrialized countries to a new socialist or communist society. Marx was put a lot more emphasis on analysis than on predictions and prescriptions, and I think it's important that Marxism is often associated with prescriptions, but in fact it's much more analysis than prescription. However, there is one slogan that definitely comes from Marx: workers of the world unite. And that slogan stems from the concept of class struggle. What Marx postulated is that there is more commonality of interest between workers of different countries than between those workers and their employers. That's what we call internationalism. In other words, Marx was aware of the somewhat transnational character of capitalist development, and to counteract it, he formulated that slogan that the workers of the world have to unite, in order not to permit capitalists to exploit them in every individual country, exploiting differences between countries. Well, today I think we live in an epoch where capitalists of the world have united. And the workers, to the extent they exist, don't seem to be doing so. But because of internationalism of Marxism, one would be justified to ask, how can it be reconciled with any nationalism, including Jewish nationalism, and an enterprise of colonization of Palestine? Should not Marxists, from communists to social democrats, oppose Zionism? But in reality, the history of Zionist movement shows that not only there was very little opposition, but in fact, there was a lot of confluence between Marxism and Zionism. We are soon approaching the 1st of May, and I just want to mention that throughout Israel, red flags were hung in the streets on the 1st of May for many decades. Kibbutz, which is the form of social organization where there's no private property and barely any individual property, was pioneered, invented by Zionist settlers in Palestine. They also created a very unusual trade union, Histadrut, that was the largest employer in Palestine. So it's a trade union becomes the largest employer. And of course, what motivated the founders of Zionist settlement in Palestine was the idea of building a new country and building a new man, which of course reminds you of similar projects articulated in the Soviet period here, to create a new man, to create a new kind of social behavior. So tonight I'll try to explain how these two, Marxism and Zionism, have interacted in history. In my previous talk here, just a few minutes ago, I mentioned something that happened in London when Winston Churchill met one of the leaders of the Zionist movement, Chaim Weizmann. And Weizmann was to convince Churchill to support Zionism. What argument did he use? He didn't use the geostrategic argument, which of course is clear. He didn't even use a religious argument, which would be working with, generally in Britain, which is the homeland of Christian Zionism. But he said, by supporting Zionism, we'll be able to strengthen the movement and attract the Jews away from socialism. So for him, it was a way of convincing the ruling class in Britain that support for Zionism will rid them of all these Jewish socialists that, of course, protest and want to create change in British society. So the idea of settling the land and settling the land to build a new society came from Jews from some Jews of Russian Empire, where many young Jews had already left Judaic practice. They had left traditional mode of life, and they were frustrated in the way society in the state regulation in the Russian Empire prevented them from assimilating and developing careers and developing their life plans. Frustration of Russian Jews was the motive force of the Zionist movement, because if it were not for Jews of Russia in the turn of the 20th century, I think that the Zionist movement would have never taken off. It would have been an interesting idea and a nice gathering of Jewish bourgeois in Europe, but it wouldn't have produced anything. Incidentally, I don't think it was said, if something is not clear during my talk, please interrupt me and ask, because we are all using a foreign language, for whatever reason. And, therefore there may be some misunderstanding or some things that I say that are not clear. So please don't hesitate to interrupt me. It's not a problem. So what these Russian Jews brought to Palestine was the idea of radical change. Now, what would be that radical change in practice? Well, they formed a commune, several communes, agricultural communes, where all decisions were made by the general meeting. There was no class structure, of course. It was all done collectively. Even the most minute decisions would be subject to the General Assembly. This kind of direct democracy affected practically all sides of life. If a member of the kibbutz wanted to study history or philosophy or whatever, even agricultural science, it's the General Assembly of the kibbutz that would decide whether he or she would go there. So there was tremendous restrictions on freedom, individual freedom in the kibbutz. Another interesting part of kibbutz, of course, is attitude towards marriage. As you know, in Judaic practice, marriage, whole procedure of marrying and the word used is the same word as holiness. It's kiddushin or kadosh. It's all from the same root. The founders of many of these kibbutzim were convinced that marriage is a survival of bourgeois society, and therefore it had no place in a new world. And in fact, they practiced pretty much free love like they did in the Soviet Union in the early 20s. The similarities with the 1920s and 30s in the Soviet Union are quite pronounced, and we'll see how articulate these similarities were felt in Palestine. So another very interesting part of reinforcing collective identity as opposed to individual identity is the way the children were brought up. Well, several books are written about children in kibbutz. One of them is famous, with Bettelheim, called Children of the Dream. The main idea of education, just like in Soviet education, but not to that extreme, was that the child has to be educated in total loyalty to the collective. How do you attain that? By separating the child from the parents. Since everyone in the kibbutz ate at a collective dining hall, no one was cooking at home. Some of you may remember, and well, not remember directly, but in 1920s, in the Soviet Union, they had this concept of fabrika kuchnia, which is exactly what was realized in kibbutz. So women were freed from cooking, and everyone ate in the communal hall. So one link with the child was broken. So the parents were no longer nourishing the child because of the collective that nourished the child. And to make that separation even more pronounced, they built children's homes in kibbutz where children slept separate from the parents. So the parents would see their child an hour or two during the day, they would play, but there was no hierarchical connection between them. That hierarchical connection, dependence on the parents, was broken. And that really created a new human being. The behavior of members of kibbutz that has been studied by many psychologists really was different. So in that sense, it was a much more radical practice than what was done here in the Soviet Union in the 20s. All of that was practiced in the belief that socialism and nationalism are the same thing. They have the same aims, and they complemented and supported one another. Now, this is a paradox, because you can see that socialism and nationalism can be connected, can be even united in one sentence, but they have tremendous contradictions. And here, we have to remember that one stream of Marxism in Europe had already worked on the idea of connection between socialism and nationalism. And that was in Austro-Hungarian Empire. In Austro-Hungarian Empire, they developed a movement of what is called Austro-Marxism, which Lenin criticized bitterly, Bernstein. He considered it a betrayal of socialism, and from his viewpoint, he was not wrong. But in Austro-Hungarian Empire, they turned the idea of class struggle into something else. Namely, the idea was proposed that a nation can be proletarian. How do you define a proletarian nation? A nation that is devoid of its own state. And so you see in the context of Austro-Hungarian Empire, like any empire, those national groups or ethnic groups that didn't have their own state were considered proletarian nations. And therefore, they were treated as part of the socialist structure. It's not an accident that the Nazi party, which we use the four letters, Nazi, but sometimes it's important to decipher it. And in deciphering it, we'll see that it's the German Nationalist Socialist Workers' Party. That's the real name. And it tells you everything, that how nationalism and socialism could be combined. And no one was really shocked by this combination. And the collectivist ethos is also part of nationalism. So collectivist ethos, in fact, dovetails very nicely with nationalism. Of course, if a nation is proletarian, that obliterates class struggle within the nation. Because we are all building a new country, we are all building a new nation, and it's not time to deal with class struggle. And that's exactly the position that was taken by some leaders of the Zionist movement. In fact, those leaders that created the state, Ben-Gurion, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, and others, they moved away from radical socialism to what my colleague at the Hebrew University called nationalist socialism. because obviously he could not use the word National Socialism, so he used the word nationalist socialism. Theoretical work was also done in order to reconcile nationalism and socialism. One of actually the only important theoretician who wrote about it was Borochov. Needless to say, a Jew from the Russian Empire, who never put a foot in Palestine. He died in 1917 in Russia. But he had been to Austria, and he developed a theory of nationalism and socialism. He was a Marxist. And Borochov is still revered, even though I think few people know who he was, in Israel. Those of you who have been to Israel must have seen Borochov Street practically in every town, because he was one of the theoreticians of socialist Zionism. Now, what were the goals of the Zionist movement that Marxism had to deal with? Because here again, the inspiration of Austro-Marxism, however important it was, and for Borochov in particular, was limited, because no nationalist movement had the challenges that the Zionist movement had. Hungarian movement or Polish movement within the Austrian Empire didn't have to move people anywhere, they didn't have to invent a language, they didn't have to do any of these things. Zionist movement, on the contrary, had to pursue four very, very important goals that I would like to identify. The first one was to transform a transnational Jewish identity centered on Torah and commandments into a national identity like Hungarian or Polish identity. This was a tremendous task. Shlomo Sand, my colleague from Tel Aviv University, believes that Jewish nationality was invented. Well, perhaps all nationality, as someone mentioned, first there were nationalists and then there were nations. And in fact, there's reason for that, because in order to conceptualize a nation, you need theoreticians. Normally, people don't identify with a nation. It has to be created. If some of you have seen the statue of La Nation in Paris, it's a very monumental expression of what La Nation should be. But it was created in the 19th century precisely in the process of creating a nation, because most people in France at that time identified with their village, with their town, with their region, but hardly with this La Nation that is embodied in that statue in Paris today. For Jews, the challenge was even greater, because the identity of Jews at the turn of the 20th century, for majority of them, it was a religious identity. Identity linked, as I said, with Torah and commandments, and even those who were not exactly fanatical followers of religion identified themselves as Jews only in religious terms. Or as someone said half-jokingly, they identified with Judaism that they didn't follow. but the identification of a French Jew, of an American Jew, a British Jew, German Jew was with Judaism. It was not with a nation. How do you create a national identity? Well, it was an impossible task in Central and Western Europe, and still is, as a matter of fact. But it was possible only in the limits of the Russian Empire. Because in the Russian Empire, as is well known, Jews were discriminated on many parameters, including in the Pale of Settlement, where they could live, but they couldn't move to big cities. And as a result of secularization that took place in Europe in general, many Jews in shtetls, many Jews in these little towns, often the majority Jews, didn't practice any Judaism anymore. They became secularized. Moreover, they learned Russian language, they identified with Russian culture, and because of the frustration that they felt, many of them joined revolutionary movements. But as they were joining the revolutionary movements in Russian Empire, they had to decide whether they're joining it as internationalists or as part of the Jewish nation. So here, again, a minority among them developed the concept of Jewish nationality, which to many of you would appear natural, given Soviet history. But it was nothing natural about it, because these young Jews, radicalized socialist Jews, redefined themselves as a nationality, very much like Lithuanians and Poles and Ukrainians who were among them. So they said, we are part of a Jewish nationality. And that was the challenge, and still is a challenge, for the Zionist movement and for Israel. Now, the less religious you are, the more probable it will be your identification with nationality. That's why the most Orthodox Jews that you would identify at a distance are very lukewarm about the concept of Jewish nationality. And why are they so lukewarm or even opposed to Jewish nationality? Because nationality imposes no behavior. You can belong to French nationality, but you don't have to drink red wine and carry a baguette under your arm. You can be a Russian and not drink vodka. I mean, there's no behavior that's prescribed by your nationality. But Jewish identity was prescriptive and still is prescriptive. A Jew, as it was said even in the Middle Ages by Saadia Gaon, a Jew is someone who says, we are only a nation thanks to Torah and commandments. And in fact, if you look at real situation, particularly at the beginning of the 20th century, you have diverse groups of Jews in different countries speaking different languages, and they have absolutely nothing in common except religious practice. So religious practice was really the common denominator, and that's precisely the denominator that had to be uprooted and to create something else, which is the secular Jewish nationality. So that's challenge number one. And it was largely affected by Jews from Russian Empire. So the invention of Russian nationality is, in a way, a Russian invention. Also, a kind of Russian invention is the new modern Hebrew. The little town of Białystok in today's Poland, at the turn of the 20th century, was a very cosmopolitan, multilingual city. People spoke Polish, Russian, Lithuanian, Yiddish, and German. And it was very common. And there were two Jews, well, there were many more Jews, but two of them decided that there has to be a universal language. And one of them invented a universal language, Esperanto, Dr. Zamenhof. Another one, Perelman, who took this a pseudonym Ben Yehuda, decided that a modern Hebrew has to be invented. And he in fact invented it, so much so that one of the Israeli linguists, Gilad Zuckerman, believes that modern Hebrew is not a Semitic language but an Indo-European one. Now, why does he believe so? Because of the syntax of the New Hebrew. His argument, actually he wrote a book in Hebrew, some of you who know Hebrew will find it amusing, Israelit Safa Yafa. So the Israeli is a beautiful language. Now why Israeli? Because he says it's a language created by native speakers of Yiddish, Polish, and Russian. And naturally they projected syntactic structures of those languages, all of which are Indo-European. And it doesn't take tremendous knowledge to figure out that syntax is different, because those of you who know modern Hebrew will realize that the structure of the sentence is totally different from what you find in the Bible, where it begins with a verb and continues. Modern Hebrew is very different. And so Zuckerman believes that the invention of that new language turned the language from its Semitic, away from Semitic roots to Indo-European structure. But it was developed, and it's one of the success stories of the 20th century, that a language that nobody practically spoke is spoken by several million people, has a very developed cultural vocabulary, scientific vocabulary, and so on. Now, and in fact, it was an extreme version of what was happening in Europe in the end of the 19th century. Lithuanian language, which was spoken largely in the rural areas and by peasants, whereas the people in the cities spoke Polish or German or Russian. The nationalists had to invent modern Lithuanian, and they did. They made a tremendous effort to create it, but their challenge was somewhat different from that of Ben Yehuda, because Hebrew contained all the philosophical and spiritual terms you need. It didn't have practical terms. Now, Lithuanian had all the practical terms, but didn't have any of the intellectual vocabulary. So this had to be invented. Because it was spoken by peasants, and to the extent they were Catholics, it was Latin Catholic at that time, so it didn't really relate very much. So the new Hebrew was created, and that was one of the challenges. Now, another challenge was, which nobody in nationalist movement in Europe had to face, was to transfer Jews from the country of origin to Palestine. You have to convince people to go, you have to find conditions for them to settle, and the fourth was to establish political and economic control of the country, something which is still very much in process, to the extent because the land was not empty, still isn't. So these four goals were totally new for other nationalist movements, and therefore the Borokhov had to deal with these issues, which he did. A very strong core of Marxists were the head of the Jewish settlement in Palestine in the first decade, the second decade of the Zionist settlement. They formed movements in Russia that, just the very name of it is quite clear, Proletariat, workers of Zion. They created many other groups as well, but Proletariat perhaps one of the more influential ones. So they wanted to build a workers' society in Palestine. one of the Israeli scholars who did very important work on the history of socialism in Israel and Zionism still is, he's alive, Zev Sternheld. Whose book, The Founding Myths of Zionism, I strongly recommend. Zev Sternheld believes that within Coalition and within the Marxist trends that existed in Zionist Palestine at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a split, and those who became leaders of the Zionist movement, namely Ben-Gurion, David Ben-Gurion and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi and their comrades, they continued to use socialist rhetoric, but in fact their main emphasis was to build a national settlement in Palestine. And that's what, in fact, he brings an article published by Ben-Gurion, not an article, sorry. He brings a speech that Ben-Gurion gave to some of the leaders of the Zionist movement. He didn't say that publicly. There was public Ben-Gurion and there was private Ben-Gurion. So the private Ben-Gurion said, and I'm paraphrasing him, we are not here to engage in self-improvement. We are here to conquer the land, and we need to build an iron wall to do so. And he used this expression, which is usually associated with Jabotinsky, his article published a year later in Rassvet, but in fact Ben-Gurion had used it before. But it also sheds light that the ideological divisions in the Zionist movement between followers of Jabotinsky, the more traditional nationalism, and the socialists, the worker movement, were largely superficial. They were tactical differences, they were not substantial differences. However passionate those debates were in those times, they really didn't see themselves as allies, but in fact, there was very little difference. So what happened is that the influence of Borokhov on actual socialist Zionist movement in Palestine waned with his death in 1917. The theories of Borokhov continued to be studied. They continued to provoke enthusiasm of many Jews in Palestine and particularly outside of Palestine. What is really remarkable is that till early 80s, Borokhov, or Zionist movements, youth movements in particular, in other countries, continued to use Borokhov as Borokhov's theories as the basis of their activities and their ideology. Many of those who used Borokhov in countries like Argentina or France actually went to Israel, settled in Israel. Many of them returned because they were disappointed by reality, which didn't correspond to their socialist image of what Israel is. But the image of Israel as a socialist society survived till, as I said, early 80s, which I find quite remarkable. Now, what happened after the death of Borokhov, what happened in the Zionist movement is that the control was taken by Ben-Gurion and his friends, who created Histadrut, which is a very important trade union, very unusual trade union. Histadrut united workers, Zionist workers, and at the same time, it developed industries. So Histadrut became the greatest, the bigger employer in Zionist Palestine. At the same time, it was a trade union. Now you could see that Histadrut embodies the idea of nationalist socialism. You cannot have a class struggle if the employer is the same as the worker. So Histadrut occupied a very important ideological niche, but at the same time, private industry and private capitalist sector was developing in Palestine. And while ideologically capitalists were frowned upon because they didn't belong to the socialist elite, in practice they were accumulating capital and accumulating wealth in order to develop a capitalist society. So they set, and that's what Zev Sternhell, among others, says, that many associate the turn from socialism to capitalism with 1977, when the labor movement lost its power in Israel. He says, no, it began in the 1920s. It just took another form in 1977. So the identity of socialists in Palestine, Zionist socialists, was very much in conflict. Because on the one hand, they saw that the socialist ideas that they brought with them from Russia were losing their importance as society developed among Zionist settlers. And at the same time, socialism, real socialism, was being built in the Soviet Union. There were very sharp debates in the early 20s as to what constitutes the Moledet, the homeland. Is the homeland where Jews supposedly came from, Palestine, biblical land, or the real homeland is the homeland where socialism is being built, which is the Soviet Union. So that debate even was so important that some of them left Palestine and went back to the Soviet Union, back to Russia. Many of them joined the Communist Party because they were very ideologically motivated to build this new society, which they felt was being betrayed in Palestine. So, in fact, the Coalition found itself as a main nationalist vector in the history of Zionist movement. And the Orthodox Marxism, which animated some of them, at least in the beginning, was more and more marginalized. And that happened in the 20s and in the 30s. While the leaders of the Zionist movement, as I said a few minutes ago, maintained socialist rhetoric. This is quite interesting because it may remind you of the Soviet experiment, where some ideological discourse didn't correspond to reality, but the discourse was maintained nonetheless. This is why we could say that the influence of Marxism was instrumental in the history of Zionist movement. What I mean by instrumental is that socialism was used by the nationalists in order to build a nationalist movement and economy and society, in order to build it separate from the existing one. Because, again, since we are talking about what some people call settler colonialism, these people didn't integrate the society as existed. They built something apart. So they built everything apart. They built the trade union, which was apart. They built armed units that were apart. They were really developing a segregated society, and in order to do so, they needed collectivism. And the easiest way to organize collectives was the socialist way. And so while some of these early socialist and Marxist and Zionist movement were honestly pursuing the dream of building a new society and building a new man, in fact, as we look back at that history, we see that they were being used by the nationalists, for whom socialism was no more than a tool of building a national economy and national society. Now, the evolution of Israel that some left-wing Zionists deplore today, says, well, Israel used to be egalitarian, today it's characterized by very sharp division between rich and poor. Israel used to pursue peace, now Israel doesn't pursue peace, and there's a lot of tremendous litany of complaints from left-wing Zionists that Israel is not what it used to be. Well, if we read Sternheld and many other historians, this disappointment is out of place. In fact, those trends began in the 20s, and they logically ended where they have ended today. So it was a rather logical process of developing of nationalist structures and nationalist institutions at the expense of socialist ones. What is surprising is not the fact that Israel today is the darling of the right. What is surprising for historians is how long it maintained its socialist image. Because when Israel was established in 1948, it was immediately accepted by the Socialist International, and it was seen as a beacon of socialist development. Many non-Jews, progressive non-Jews, went to kibbutz to become volunteers for a year or two. Some members of Quebec government, well, today they're members of government, but at a certain point, young people, they went, non-Jews, went to Israel to build kibbutz, to participate in that collective endeavor. So what is very interesting is that the socialist movement ignored many things that happened in Israel. Among them, the dispossession of Palestinians, the expulsion, all of these things were ignored. And how was it ignored? That's very interesting. If you look at the discourse of the socialist movement after 48 in particular, in the world, the international socialist movement, they would say, well, it was necessary measure in order to build a new progressive society, whereas the Arabs at that did not have that level of political consciousness. So it was a form of enlightenment colonialism, if I can call it this way. In that sense, it was quite interesting that the Socialist International accompanied Israel and protected Israel even when Israel began a war, like in 1967. But eventually, the internal processes in Israel itself and in the world led to much more overt union between the right wing in other countries and the state of Israel. And today I would say that support for Israel and support for the Zionist structure of Israel is very much correlated with the right wing and the wealth in the West. Someone said that in Canada, support for Israel increases with your personal income. With personal income, with the money you have. Because very often Zionist organizations, when they have gala concerts and support for Israel, they would invite President of the Royal Bank, who is perfectly non-Jewish, or some other big capitalist in order to attract public attention. So today, those socialists who were concerned in the 20s that nationalist movement was taken over. Well, today I think they are vindicated. They were perfectly right. That's exactly what happened. And Israel today supplies also tools, very important tools, for the maintenance of neoliberal order of economy by supplying a tremendous amount of security equipment and security know-how. Because Israel not only has one of the highest levels of split between rich and poor, I think number 1 or 2 in the OECD countries, but it also supplies tools to maintain that order, namely how to control population. There's a militarization of police forces in North America in particular, where, say, Israel plays a very important role in terms of supplying know-how and supplying tools of population control, or pacification, whichever way you want to call it. So Marxism and Zionism indeed walked together for the first 2 decades. They continued to walk separate ways after that, and they totally divorced each other in the 1970s. Today, those who oppose Zionism would identify themselves with Marxism. And they may not be aware that Marxism, at one point, was the foundation, was at the foundation of the Zionist movement. Thank you.